I want to talk a little about VMware's relationship to open source. You have two announcements at VMware that are related to that. One is support for Okada, I believe is the name of the latest OpenStack release, and it's sort of container layer. And another is for Kubernetes in Cloud Foundry, which is your sister company Pivotal's product. Containers are a very hot area right now. And you've also been involved, VMware very early on was involved in the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which was in turn founded by the guy who developed Kubernetes. So containers and container management and orchestration is very much an open source sort of area. On the other hand, for example, OpenStack is one of the leading competitors in the private cloud. Why are you helping the competition? And do you see containers as sort of ultimately succeeding virtualization as well?
Yeah, and let me start by just being clear. We think containers are cool. We think containers are great. We love them. We're going to enable them. And the primary benefit of containers is an accelerated application development, deployment, and lifecycle management. For the most part, we don't see it as replacing virtualization. It's really not about an infrastructure, right? It's about enabling application development. So that's how we see the benefits. And now our job is saying, how can we make this cool new innovation in containers, really sort of like the Java, if you could, 2-3 decades later, you and I have been around for a while. Yeah. We remember, run, write once, run anywhere, all the Java mantra. And today, that embodiment of the application and being able to wrap, deploy it, all of the necessary registry and other aspects of the application. Containers are cool that way. It's a very powerful technology. But then our job is, how can we make containers easy? How can we cross that bridge between the developer and the DevOps and the infrastructure and operations and be able to say yes to both of them? Yes, you can go on this crazy melee of open source technologies and all this creative innovation that's going on in that space, but turn around and say, that's right, you don't have to stand up a new hunk of infrastructure. You can operationalize this. We do provide you security, management, networking, partitioning, all of those things that are foundational to your infrastructure, and yet you can say yes to those crazy developers in that open source community. That's exactly where VMware is aimed. So we have two major announcements that we're doing. The VIO announcement, VMware Integrated OpenStack, grabbing the next set of OpenStack bits, really integrating them to the rest of the VMware stack to make it easy for customers who are pursuing OpenStack to do so on top of their VMware franchise. And we see that to some limited degree in enterprise customers, but we see that enormously in the service provider and telco space. And that's where we see that really being big and important, and we'll have more to say about that at VMworld in Europe, where there's more of a service provider focus. The second announcement is this idea of Pivotal Container Service that VMware is partnering with Pivotal and Kubernetes to create. And the three core components associated with that offering are NSXT, our innovation in terms of being able to integrate container networking directly into NSX, and being able to use the security, the partitioning, microsegmentation, the automation of the networking, being able to leverage the cluster management and all of those aspects of Kubernetes, and really embracing and participating heavily in that community, and then combining that with the capabilities of the Pivotal platform. And really having a container-focused offering for the marketplace. We think this gives, really hits an interesting capability where the Pivotal Cloud Foundry, it's a highly curated environment for day one, day two operations in a very complete and robust way. If the developer wants something that is, I'll say, less curated, but still embraces containers and Kubernetes, that's exactly where PKS is focused, and all of that built on the VMware infrastructure. So we think this is a very powerful answer to solve that gap between the developer and the operations personnel and bringing those two worlds together.
Right. Particularly, I mentioned the NSX aspect, since networking of containers has always been sort of a sticking point there.
Oh yeah, and the container networking today is sort of like circa 1990, right? Kind of networking, port to port, right? Defining groups and so on. It's like, well, this is pretty primitive, and the new standard community is agreeing on container native interfaces. And those networking, and we're adding that to the NSX platform. So it becomes quite an elegant solution. We've integrated that with the pivotal lifecycle management environment, so that makes it very elegant for the developer. And to customers, particularly those who've already embraced NSX, it's sort of like, whether it's a VM or a container makes no difference. I see the same thing from my perspective.
Right, and how does Photon fit into all that?
Well, initially the Photon OS is one of the OSs that's supported as part of that, and we'll be laying out a strategy and roadmap for deeper integration of Photon as the default native OS environment. But all of these are components that, if you happen to be an Atomic fan, or if you happen
Core
to be a
OS.
Ubuntu or Core OS, you'll be able to pick a different Linux distro as your primary container runtime environment. But our perspective is we're going to make Photon quite elegant to be the natural choice when you're running in this environment.
Sure. So I have to ask you one more question about this, and this is just sort of over the long term, right? Virtualization versus containers on bare metal. Doesn't the future sort of argue that one day we'll go past the virtual machine to actually doing containers, managing containers on bare metal?
Well, our objective is that it's not containers or VMs. That it's just, we make it so easy to run your container inside of a VM. Why would you dream of not doing that? Because a container is relying on OS security and partitioning. Right? Last year, I think the last count was there was 19 security patches in the Linux kernel.
Right.
19. There were 0 in the VM last year. Right? And it's those kind of differences that people start to say, wow, if it's easy, it's integrated, it's managed this way, why wouldn't I? And particularly as we hope to touch on, we're also announcing App Defense, a cool new way to be able to do virtual machine-based fingerprinting of good behavior. And wow, when you've done that in the VM, you put the container in the VM, you now have another layer of security that just comes for free. As part of the container being in the VM. You could go create a different networking environment, but hey, put it in the VM. We've already done a lot of that work associated with it already. You sort of get it for free. And so, silicon-based partitioning. Wow, you could go, say, oh, let's go do native bare metal containers on Linux, and then you say, well, I really sort of want the silicon partitioning, so let's bring a VM back into the picture. And I'll make one last point on this. Who is the smartest company in the world on running containers today? Right, you'd probably argue Google, right? Did a lot of the core innovation.
They did C groups.
Yeah, all the things, the innovate, the core force behind Kubernetes. They run their containers in VMs. Right, and I don't think it's arbitrary that that's the case today, right? When you work really hard to get rid of something, you find that it has such value associated with it. So make it easy to harvest the value, and that's what our agenda would be. But hey, with CNI, container native interfacing, what we're doing with vSAN and cross cloud services, it's not a religious issue for us. Hey, we're going to support container value propositions with or without the VM, but we think the vast majority of customers will realize that there's just a lot of benefit here.